Okay, how's it going, guys? I'm gonna do that NP-01 video today. Sorry for it being pretty delayed. Yeah. So if you haven't seen the bit in the Aria review where I talk about this mouse, I'll try to summarize it really quick. So for a long time, my complaint with this mouse was that when I tried to do a pretty regular relaxed claw grip like this, I would run into this issue where, because the mouse is completely flat across the top and naturally I leave my wrist at a slight tilt, it would cause my index and sometimes my middle knuckles to kind of float above the hump of the mouse. And that would get pretty annoying and fatiguing during longer gaming sessions. The mouse always gave me a nice locked in kind of a feeling. And this front corner here is slightly more tucked in, thinner than the outsets. And I also preferred that aspect of its shape. But the way that it would not really properly support my first two knuckles here was always frustrating enough that I never really stuck with it long term. So around the time that I got the Aria and I changed my grip style to kind of push the mouse further forward in my hand, it worked out in such a way where the NP-01 became a much more viable shape for me. And partly that's basically due to the shape of this corner here. And what was going on was that previously my knuckles were high enough up on the hump here that the right side of my hand, my last two knuckles, were sitting here. And so they were being forced to sit at this height, which is roughly the same as where my index and middle knuckles would sit on the other side. By pushing the mouse slightly further forward in my hand, all my knuckles move further back on the mouse, but because I hold it in a way where you can see that my ring and pinky knuckles sit slightly further back on the mouse here, longitudinally, then the effect that you get is now, instead of sitting up here, they're sitting more down here. And so it creates a height discrepancy between where my index and ring finger knuckles are sitting. And that means I'm able to grip the mouse with a slight tilt and have proper support for my first two knuckles this way. And so by pushing the mouse further forward in my hand, the shape became immensely more comfortable for me to use during long gaming sessions. Other benefit of doing this is that by pushing it forward, my pinky and thumb hit the mouse further towards the back where the mouse is wider, which was also more comfortable for me than trying to grip the mouse here at kind of the narrowest point with my pinky, which is what I was doing previously. Other than that, it's a Vaxee mouse, so broadly my comments about, like a stock outset still apply here. The clicks are all really good. There's a tiny bit of, I won't be able to demonstrate it to you, but there's just a hair of movement right at the top of the button travel where it can just disconnect from the switch plunger. So this copy is like probably not even a tenth of a millimeter under tensioned. It's slightly frustrating that I know it's there, but it doesn't actually have any tangible effect in terms of creating rattle or noise while using the mouse to game. So I just kind of said, that's all right. I'll just live with it and not focus on it if I can, so I don't get too peeved off about knowing it's not perfect. The scroll wheel on this copy is a little bit loose and rattly. They actually changed the scroll wheel design slightly with these full matte versions. It's back to being more like the Zowie scroll wheels, where there's a ball bearing that's supported by some springs inside the scroll wheel, rather than the more kind of I'm not sure really how to describe the difference in mechanisms, partly because I can't picture both of them clearly mentally. But if you've opened up like an EC2B or something and looked at the scroll wheel in that, when you take it apart, you probably know what I'm talking about. The mechanism inside the scroll wheel looks like a miniaturized version of that EC scroll wheel. So anyway, it creates a little bit more looseness and rattle, and I would have had to do something to generate more spring tension by shimming something under the springs to get them to push the ball bearing against the outer ring harder. So it's no longer, the rattle on this mouse is not an issue that's caused by a lack of tension from the scroll mechanism not being pushed together firmly enough, the way that it was on the C series, like an S1C, or on the older Vaxee mice. That was what you could do to improve the scroll wheel and remove rattle from it, was to use tape to push the halves of the scroll wheel together more firmly. That no longer fixes the problem on these mice, which is unfortunate because that was kind of an easy and straightforward solution to that problem. So a little bit frustrating. And so I just kind of left the scroll wheel on this one alone. It's rattly, but it's serviceable. It's certainly not the best because you lose a lot of the definition between steps when you start scrolling quickly. But it's nice enough for scrolling quickly because it's sort of loose. So I was just like, whatever, it's fine for living with day to day. Anyway, the other thing that I've started to notice more on stock Vaxee mice, the more that I've used them, and is particularly noticeable in the NP-01 as a result of the way that my fingers interact with the top curve of the mouse, leaving some space underneath the first joint of my fingers. I tend to accidentally click this mouse quite a lot, and unfortunately, it's also a little bit frustrating to try and click quickly with sometimes because the switches don't quite feel like they rebound as nicely as I would want them to. They're just a little bit limp when you hold them down, which obviously makes them very suitable for holding them down for long periods of time because you don't get like fatigued. But the trade-off is that you can't spam click them as quickly, and overall they feel a little bit sluggish and unresponsive when you let go of them. So it's I mean, on my outset where I replaced the white outset, where I replaced them with Huano blue shell pink dots, or like 68 grams force, that kind of more average copy of a pink dot switch. And those are a hair stiffer than average, but anyway, it gives you so much more rebound force compared to these stock Vaxee switches that it totally fixes that problem. I mean, yes, they're slightly more tiring to spam click, but you can spam click them essentially as fast as I'm able to, and I can't detect any real shortcoming or drawback to the clicks in terms of spamability with an average Huano pink dot mounted in there. So I don't know. Anyhow, yeah. Okay, what else is there? Thumb buttons are usual Vaxee thumb buttons, although they do feel a hair less crisp than the glossy outsets. I haven't opened this one up to look, but I know that Huano does make a 2-pin 3.5mm micro switch, which is what they use for the thumb buttons in this mouse, as well as the scroll click. And I know that I believe on the last one of these I opened up and looked at, they were using a Huano scroll click with a red dot, but I could be wrong about that. So potentially they've swapped these white dot thumb switches over to Huano as well, because this click feel just feels more like a Huano version of this switch than the very like absurdly snappy actuation that you got from the older versions of like the outset, which have a Kale 2-pin 3.5mm micro switch for the thumb buttons. So anyway, really nitpicky there. They're still among the best thumb buttons on the market, and these are slightly more spammable and rebound a little bit better than the Kales do. So overall, I think they're more functional, even if the ridiculousness of their crispness is not as apparent. And that was kind of something that was it was enjoyable for the spectacle of it, just how ridiculously like sort of zero pre-travel and insanely sharp actuation the thumb switches were on the outset. But it's, yeah, again, these are more actually functional. So let's see, I'm pretty much described all the buttons. Skates are the same as an outset. They're a little bit slower overall than I'd like. I don't think I prefer skates this large in general. if I were going to main this mouse long term, I would probably just use some dot skates in the corners and one at the bottom center to prevent it from tipping backwards if I push down on the back of the mouse. So yeah, I don't know, just sort of matches my preferences a little bit better. Other than that, not too much to say. One thing that's always annoyed me a little bit with NP-01 is that I think overall, um, I wish the back end of the mouse were slightly more gradual and that the front end was slightly taller overall. Um, First of all, that would make the curve of the top of the mouse more natural to support the first joint of my fingers here, which would reduce the rate of accidental clicks and make it feel a little bit more comfortable. The other thing that that would do is to help pick my hand up slightly higher, because the way that the mouse is with its current height, it always feels like I'm having to remind myself to curl my ring and pinky fingers a little bit more to prevent them from dragging on the pad when I don't want them to. Sometimes I will deliberately drop them down to get more feedback from the pad's surface. It can help me with my flick accuracy in certain situations. But yeah, overall, the mouse just feels slightly too sort of slammed down on the mouse pad, a little bit too flat for what would be ideal for my hand size and grip style. But that's been a complaint since the mouse came out. And for most people who don't have 10.5 centimeter wide hands, you probably won't run into that issue, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. Anyway, I don't know. It just, yeah, just like having used it a lot more recently reinforces that what I wish Vaxee would do is release a mouse that sits between this one and the outset, so that it would have a slight tilt, more like a G403, G703. It doesn't have to be this tall. A height between the outset and the NP-01 would be fine. So taller overall, slight amount of tilt, and again, move the hump a little bit further forward to give it more of that outset style curvature across the top for better palm and finger support. Make it a little bit more of an ergo-y shape instead of a slightly ergonified that's not a word anyway, version of a Zowie S2 S1 hybrid. The back end of this mouse is basically S1 tall, and the front end is like S2 ish, so whatever. Anyway, yes, so that pretty much sums up my thoughts on it in general. Overall, I find I play quite well with this mouse, although it still does get a little bit, it's not fatiguing to use on long sessions, but I do find that the longer I play with it, I will start to get slightly annoyed with some very minor aspects of its shape. Not enough to make me dislike the mouse, but enough to just make me want to use something else, kind of for the sake of variety, I guess, but mainly just to have a break from the particular feel of using this mouse. Um, and so it doesn't quite have the same, the longer I use it, the more locked in I get characteristic, which is like what kind of sets the outset apart from a lot of other mice for me. So anyway, hopefully that all makes sense and answered some questions about the shape, especially with my new grip. If you do have anything else you want to know, they also did make the scroll click lighter on these newer copies, and the cable is more flexible than the old Vaxee cables, although it's not as flexible as most other brands. It's still probably a little bit stiffer than a C-series Zowie cable, but this is a definite improvement in my mind over the original original Vaxee cable, and I'm perfectly happy to use this one in a bungee, and I don't feel any need to paracord these newer copies. So yeah, okay, that does it. Thank you guys for watching. Again, if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments, and I will answer them. And other than that, please do like the video if this was helpful, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.